They were the men who caused the most brutal and deadliest conflict in human history, the men who ordered armies to invade other countries, and those who ordered slaughter on an unprecedented level never seen before. The top Nazis all vied and fought for influence and power, and they wanted to be seen in the eyes of the Führer as favourable. Men like Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring bickered constantly, and there was much backstabbing within the inner circle. But as their war effort crumbled and faltered, the net closed in on some of the most barbaric men in history, and some sought to take the easy way out, and others thought they would try their chances at a war crimes trial. In this video, we look at the fates of some of the top Nazis, and we look at what happened in their final moments, from the crumbling ruins of Berlin under heavy Soviet artillery, to the execution chamber within Nuremberg prison, to the dark and damp walls of a prison built for 7,000 that housed one final man. This is the brutal end of the top Nazis. Now, we must start at the very top when we look at the top Nazis, and the most powerful. Hitler, the Führer and dictator of Nazi Germany, sought to create an empire which would have rivaled other epic empires in history and establish a 1,000-year Reich, but in reality it lasted just 12 years. In the final days of the war, Berlin was surrounded and was encircled by the Soviet Red Army, and there was little way out for those who were very well known. Hitler, who was at the time in 1945 rather frail, realised finally, in late 1945, that the war was over, and the net was closing in on him. He decided with this to die by his own hand, and he had previously tested cyanide capsules given to him by head of the SS Heinrich Himmler on his pet dog Blondie and other animals found in the Führer bunker in Berlin, Hitler's underground concrete lair under the Reich Chancellery, the former governmental headquarters. He had received instruction previously that attempts to defend Berlin were futile, as defenders were running out of ammunition, and with this he married his girlfriend Eva Braun and prepared for his death. Hitler, being an old First World War soldier, believed poison was not the way to go, and he would, inside his study in the Führer bunker on the 30th of April 1945, at roughly 3 p.m, turn a pistol on himself. He and his wife had previously said their goodbyes to their friends and closest adjutants, but then a gunshot was heard. Hitler's adjutants rushed into the study and found his body slumped on a sofa next to that of Eva Braun's corpse. Hitler's temple was leaking blood, and this was pooling on the floor. He had used his Walther PPK pistol to bring his life to an end, and Eva Braun had no visible wounds, showing she died from cyanide poisoning. It has been theorised that Hitler may have also consumed cyanide shortly before the gunshot, but this would not be the end. His body was collected in a rug, and it was taken up the stairs of the Führer bunker's emergency exit into the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Hitler had left instructions specifically to burn his corpse and reduce it to complete ashes, and despite huge and mass fuel shortages all across Germany, a rather significant amount of petrol was gathered just for the purpose of burning the body. The corpse of Hitler was placed into a bomb crater and was covered in fuel, and attempts to light the corpse to begin with were rather failing. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, then went into the bunker and lit some paper, and then threw this onto the body, and for hours the corpse was being burned. It was said that Hitler's corpse was partially covered by a blanket or a rug, and as it smouldered and burned, the top of his head could be seen, as could his lower legs and feet. By 6 p.m. that evening, the remains had been reduced to a collection of charred bones and a pile of ash that fell apart when touched. These remains were then covered over in a bomb crater. They were then allegedly found days later by the Soviets. Heinrich Himmler was the head of the SS, and it has been found in the aftermath of World War II that he may have been subverting Hitler at times, and have been attempting to make a plot to actually run the Reich himself. Himmler was one of the worst war criminals in history, and his SS were responsible for the concentration camps, the executions of millions in occupied lands, and many more horrific crimes. He spent the last few days of the war without purpose and a job, as on the 28th of April 1945, Hitler sacked him from all his Nazi posts and ordered his arrest, as he had discovered that Himmler had been attempting peace negotiations with the Allies behind Hitler's back, in an attempt to save his own skin. The Allies thought that the only person powerful enough to bring down Hitler was Heinrich Himmler, but in the final days of the war, the former head of the SS spent time travelling to try and evade capture. He was very much a hunted man, and he tried to go into hiding. On the 11th of May 1945, with a small group of SS companions, he headed south to Friedrichskoog, and then they went to Neuhaus. On the 21st of May, Himmler and 2 aides were stopped and held at a checkpoint by former Soviet prisoners of war. He then was moved around different camps, and he was eventually identified by the British. Himmler admitted who he truly was, and he was then taken to the British 31st Civilian Internment Camp for interrogation, and was then moved to the headquarters of the 2nd British Army at Lüneburg. He had been searched previously, but then a more thorough search was conducted of him, and during this he bit down on a cyanide capsule that he had hidden in his mouth, and he then fell to the floor and began convulsing. There were efforts by the Allies to revive him, and this may have even resulted in significantly broken ribs, and attempts to wash the poison out of his mouth also occurred. But Himmler, within minutes of consuming the poison, was dead. He had escaped the hangman's noose, which would have undoubtedly been awaiting him. He was then buried on Lüneburg Heath in an unmarked grave, and may still rest there today. Hermann Göring was the Reichsmarschall and the commander of the Luftwaffe. A flamboyant and pompous figure, he was the subject of ridicule by other members of the inner circle, but Göring could laugh at himself and poke fun at himself. He was, however, a cunning and scheming man, and like Himmler, Göring spent the final days of the war shunned and threatened with even execution. Göring had also tried to seize control of the Reich, and he believed Hitler was incapacitated in Berlin and could not rule effectively, and being the second in command and appointed successor, Göring believed it was his right to assume the position of Führer. But when Hitler found out about this, he was furious and ordered Göring stripped of all his rank and positions. He became a prisoner of the Americans at the end of the war and was brought to the Nuremberg trial. Göring was found to have been the most intelligent defendant, and in the courtroom he often gave his accusers and prosecutors a runaround. Göring was sentenced to death for all of the Nuremberg charges. It was said that, for Göring was often, indeed almost always, the moving force, second only to his leader. He was the leading war aggressor, both as political and as military leader. He was the director of the slave labour programme and the creator of the oppressive programme against the Jews and other races, at home and abroad. All of these crimes he has frankly admitted. But Göring would not go through the gallows. He would escape this fate by a matter of hours. He had asked to be shot like a soldier, but was instead to be hanged as a common criminal. But the night before his hanging was due to take place, inside of his prison cell, and despite being guarded around the clock, Göring took a concealed cyanide capsule from a tub of cream and then bit down on it. When it was discovered he had consumed poison, there were attempts to revive him, but all of these failed. Göring had been left bloodied by these attempts to revive him. His body was then displayed to many witnesses in the aftermath of the Nuremberg hangings to show that Hermann Göring was in fact dead. How he got the poison still remains a slight mystery today, and it is believed that a friendly US guard helped him obtain this. Göring's body was cremated, and his ashes were then scattered in the river Isar. Joseph Goebbels, on the other hand, the head of Hitler's propaganda and Enlightenment ministry, would never make it to trial. He was loyal as a dog to Hitler, and was someone who is said to have been Hitler's closest and best friend. Goebbels remained in Berlin in the final days of the war, and he was the Gauleiter, or regional leader of the capital of the Reich. He knew that the war was coming to an end, and despite trying to rally Berliners to fight the Soviets, there was nothing they could do. He encouraged old men and even children to lay their lives down, but Goebbels inside the Führer bunker, alongside Hitler, saw the last days of the Führer's life, and even acted as a witness at Hitler's wedding. But following Hitler's death, he was made the Chancellor, and he carried out one sole act in this position, and that was trying to get some form of a ceasefire for Berlin from the Soviets, but this was not successful. In the meantime, he and his wife had arranged for their children to be killed, as they believed a life without Hitler and National Socialism wasn't one which was worth living, even for their young children. On the 1st of May 1945, a day after the death of Hitler, Joseph Goebbels made his way out of the Führerbunker's emergency exit alongside his wife Magda. Together they walked arm in arm through the bombed-out garden, filled with bomb craters. What happened next isn't completely certain. Either Goebbels pulled out a pistol and shot himself, or he may have even shot his wife after she bit down on a cyanide capsule. There is also a belief that the pair just consumed cyanide. Nonetheless, their remains were then littered with bullets by an SS adjutant, who was instructed by Goebbels to make sure that they'd both been killed. After this, they also wanted their remains cremating in the same area of the garden as Hitler had been burned. But most of the fuel had been used on the Führer, and the body of Goebbels was only left partially burned. In fact, it was still quite recognisable, despite being charred. His prosthetic device fitted to his leg was also found charred, and his body, when discovered, was shown burned poorly, and his arms were frozen up in a morbid way. The bodies of the Goebbelses had not been buried either. These remains would, as Hitler's would, remain on Earth for 25 years after the war, as they were actually buried under a Schmerz facility in Magdeburg, before being burned once and for all by the Soviets in 1970. Arguably one of the worst fates suffered by a high-ranking Nazi at the end of the war fell to Rudolf Hess, the former Deputy Führer. Hess had fallen from favour and been made out to be a lunatic following his failed peace mission to Britain, in which he had taken a Messerschmitt aircraft and landed in Scotland. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner of war of the British, and despite multiple attempts to take his life, he was brought to the Nuremberg trials. Many, even during the Nazis' rise to power, had seen Hess as a bit of an oddball, a man who was obsessed with the occult and strange remedies, and he was a hypochondriac. He was, in the eyes of some, also rather mad. At Nuremberg, he rocked forward strangely on his chair, and he also was removed from the courtroom a number of times. He tried to claim he had been poisoned, but somehow he escaped execution. His failed flight had actually saved him, as he'd been in British captivity before the final solution entered its deadliest stages, despite the fact Hess had been instrumental in the creation of the persecuting Nuremberg laws. Now he was sentenced to life imprisonment, and for Hess this literally meant life. He never saw the outside of Spandau prison in Berlin, except for hospital appointments. He was imprisoned alongside the other locked-up Nazis, including Albert Speer and Karl Dönitz, but they would all be released, and Hess would never, despite the calls for this. He could have offered some help to his cause if he would have repented and took back some of his opinions, but he remained a staunch Nazi, even in his final days. He was being driven further mad by his imprisonment, and he claimed he was being poisoned and would scream constantly into the night. But on the 17th of August 1987, the 93-year-old Rudolf Hess was discovered in the summer house within Spandau prison's garden. He had taken his own life using an extension cable from a lamp strung over a window latch. He wrote a letter to his family thanking them for their support over the years. Some believe that Hess was too frail to have taken this course of action himself, but the autopsy report said otherwise. He was buried in a family plot in the town of Wunsiedel, but his body was actually dug up and cremated after the grave attracted a lot of unwanted attention. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the pompous foreign minister of the Nazi Party, was seen at the start of World War II as a major aggressor and a warmonger. He was someone who the inner circle viewed as a trumped-up champagne salesman who got lucky, and he was in no uncertain terms a foreign policy fool. He, however, managed to get the Soviets to sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, an agreement in which the Soviets and Nazis agreed to a 10-year ceasefire, but this of course would be broken with Operation Barbarossa. As the war continued, Ribbentrop's role became less significant, but he was inside of Berlin on Hitler's last birthday, but he then went on the run. He knew he would be seen as a war criminal, and he was captured on the 14th of June 1945 and was then seized by the British. At the Nuremberg trials, Ribbentrop was seen as one of the most important cogs behind the outbreak of the Second World War, and in prison he remained loyal to Hitler, and he said that, even with all I know now, if in this cell Hitler should come to me and say do this, I would still do it. Ribbentrop was the first of the Nuremberg Nazis to be executed and hanged by US executioner John C. Woods on the gallows on the 16th of October 1946. His execution was one which took a significantly longer time than it should have. In the years after Nuremberg, it's been viewed that Woods, the executioner, was a bungling and botching man who had little skill. It took 14 long minutes for Ribbentrop to die after he was sent crashing through the gallows. It was said specifically by a witness about the execution that von Ribbentrop was able to maintain his apparent stoicism to the last. He walked steadily towards the scaffold between the two guards, but he did not answer at first when an officer standing at the foot of the gallows went through the formality of asking his name. When the query was repeated, he almost shouted, "Joachim von Ribbentrop," and then mounted the steps without any sign of hesitation. When he was turned around on the platform to face the witnesses, he seemed to clench his teeth and raise his head with the old arrogance. When asked whether he had any final message, he said, "God protect Germany," in German, and then added, "May I say something else?" The interpreter nodded, and the former diplomatic wizard of Nazism spoke his last words in loud, firm tones. "My last wish is that Germany realise its entity, and that an understanding be reached between East and West. I wish peace on the world." As the black hood was placed in position on his head, von Ribbentrop looked straight ahead. Then the hangman adjusted the rope, pulled the lever, and von Ribbentrop slipped away to his fate. They, the guards, emerged at 1:30 a.m. and spoke to an American colonel. The colonel swung around and, facing official witnesses, snapped to attention to say, "The man is dead." Two GIs quickly appeared with a stretcher, which was carried up and lifted into the interior of the scaffold. The hangman mounted the gallows steps, took a large commando-type knife out of a sheath strapped to his side, and cut the rope. Von Ribbentrop's limp body, with the black hood still over his head, was removed to the far end of the room and placed behind a black canvas curtain. This had all taken less than 10 minutes. Martin Bormann was someone who was not known about by large amounts of the German population. He was Hitler's private secretary, and a man who spun the words of other Nazis to elevate his own position. He has been referred to as the gatekeeper, or the Brown Eminence, but in the ruins of Berlin, Bormann's life came to an end in a rather strange way. Now, the truth about his demise and fate remained a mystery for decades. Some believed Bormann escaped to South America and may have gotten away and lived out under a false name. But in 1972, in West Berlin, human remains were found near to the Lehrte station. These remains contained glass fragments in the jaws of two skeletons, showing that the men had consumed a cyanide capsule. Now, injuries on the corpse and skeleton of one of the victims were consistent with known injuries that Martin Bormann had sustained, and the skeleton and shape of the skull were identical to Bormann's. Later, the remains were conclusively identified as belonging to Martin Bormann through DNA testing, but what happened to him inside of Berlin was rather dark. He had tried to escape the burning ruins of Berlin and was part of a breakout group from the Führer bunker after Hitler's death. The group containing Bormann had surfaced near to Friedrichstrasse station, and they had possibly used the cover of a Tiger tank to try and cross a bridge. But allegedly Bormann and a few others then split up and went on the run, and alongside SS Doctor Ludwig Stumpfegger, Bormann tried to get across a railway bridge near to a shunting yard. The Soviets were everywhere, but at some point Hitler Youth leader Arthur Axmann claimed he saw the body of Bormann but did not know how he died. What seemingly happened is that with the net closing all around them, Bormann and Stumpfegger had bit down on cyanide capsules as the explosions of Soviet artillery echoed all around. His remains were cremated 55 years after the end of the war. The most senior commander and official inside of the German military was Wilhelm Keitel, a man referred to as a lackey, and someone who would do anything that Hitler wanted. Keitel was at the end of the war brought to the Nuremberg trials, and as the commander of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, he was sentenced to death and was linked to the signing of many illegal orders. Keitel inside of the prison gave himself over to God, and his final words on the gallows were, "I call on Almighty God to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their deaths for the fatherland before me. I follow now my sons, all for Germany." But as the executioner John C. Woods released the trapdoor, the problems began. The trapdoor was too small, and Keitel smashed his head on the way through the gallows, and the height and velocity of the drop did not snap his neck. This all left Keitel heavily bloodied, and it took a staggering 24 minutes for him to be pronounced dead. He was kicking and struggling for some time as the life was choked out from him. It was claimed about his execution that Keitel did not appear as tense as von Ribbentrop. He held his head high, with his hands being tied behind, and walked erect towards the gallows with a military bearing. When asked his name, he responded loudly and mounted the gallows as he might have mounted a reviewing stand to take a salute from German armies. He certainly did not appear to need the help of guards who walked alongside, holding his arms. When he turned around atop the platform, he looked over to the crowd with the iron-jawed haughtiness of a proud Prussian officer. His last words were uttered in a full, clear voice. After his black-booted uniformed body plunged through the trap, witnesses agreed Keitel had shown more courage on the scaffold than in the courtroom, where he had tried to shift his guilt upon the ghost of Hitler, claiming that all was the Führer's fault and that he merely carried out orders and had no responsibility. There were a number of other high-ranking Nazis whose death is not as well known about. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and Minister of Armaments and War Production, served out his prison sentence inside of Spandau prison, and he was then released and spent time writing books and appearing strangely on chat shows. He tried to portray himself as a good Nazi, but he really wasn't, and evidence has been found after the war pointing to the fact that he personally signed off on the creation of gas chambers inside Auschwitz. Speer travelled widely, but on the 1st of September 1981, he suffered a stroke in London in the company of his mistress and died from this. Karl Dönitz was the successor to Hitler and the head of the Reich and head of state, and he too was locked up inside of Spandau prison. He wrote books upon his release about his experiences as a U-boat commander and as the President of Germany for roughly 20 days. He was unrepentant about World War II and his role, but in 1980, at the age of 89, he had a massive heart attack and died, and he was actually honoured by many former servicemen and foreign naval officers at his funeral. Also, those who attended his funeral included over 100 holders of the Nazi medal, the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.